Romans chapter 1, verse 16, the Apostle Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and then to the Greek. And so what we're asserting is that Jesus, the gospel, the good news, can meet every basic need of your life. And we're focusing right now, we have for a few weeks, on the fact that Jesus can meet your need for his presence in the storms of life. So in John chapter 6, we read the following in verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake, where they got into the boat and set off across the lake of Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not joined them yet. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. When they had rowed 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. So that's what we've looked at the last several weeks. We talked about the backdrop, that he had fed 20,000 people, and now they're in the boat, and the waves come up. That was the bumpy boat ride, if you're taking notes on the outline. And then last week we said the brother shows up. Jesus shows up. He shows up. He's there with them in this very difficult time, this troubled time. But now we come to the next thing, and that is he shows up, and now we're going to look at the blessing. The blessing. In verse number 19, it says that they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. I remember times over the years when I was terrified, especially as a little boy. I remember one specific time. I lived in Ohio. I must have been 7 years old. I walked around the corner to a little store called Charlie Lynn's. It was kind of a little sundry. That's where I bought my comic books. But it was late at night. It was like 8 or 9 at night. It was dark. I was coming home. I thought I heard somebody behind me, and I was walking. And one of the things I had learned was the 23rd Psalm. So what I started doing is yelling out, the Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. And so I said the whole thing because I had memorized it. And so that voice of the word that I had memorized kind of gave me the courage to get on home. Let me tell you what Jesus said here in verse 20. As he came to them on the water, he says, but he said to them, it is I. Don't be afraid. So what I want you to think about for a second here is the voice of God. The voice of God. Now, I've never heard an audible voice of God. Maybe you have. I haven't. But I hear the voice of God all the time in his book called the Bible. And the voice of God can do amazing things in your life and in my life. And so the voice of God, Jesus's voice, drives our fears away. No matter what we're going through, he can be that calming factor that deals with the fears in our lives. So one of the things I want to illustrate this with is, before we close today, is this. Maybe you need to hear the voice of God in some situation in your life. I'm just going to pick one out. I think one of the greatest needs with men and women in our country is to hear the voice of God in terms of what he says he thinks about you. One of the greatest needs is to understand our value and our worth. And if that were solved in our lives, it would change so much about how we operate and go about in the relationships, in particular in our life. So here's what he thinks. Here's his voice about what he thinks about you and your value and your worth. Number one, you got to understand that God made you. Read Ephesians chapter number 2 and see what he said. He says you're his masterpiece. Number 2, he loves you. John 3:16, for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. So he loves you. He will never love you any more or any less than he loves you right now. He just loves you. Number 3, he died for you. Look at Romans chapter 5, verse 6. It was at the very time that we were powerless to help ourselves that Christ died for sinful men and women. Imagine that. If you didn't matter, why would he have come after you? Why would he have given his life on the cross? Think about that. Number 4, he's got a plan for your life. It says in Jeremiah 29:11, for I know the plans I have for you. And then finally, God has gifted you. Read Ephesians chapter number 4. So what's that all about today? What am I trying to say here that he's trying to say here to you and me? You hear his voice today, and your doubts and your fears will go away. You think about that.